going to be calling on Vignesh as we wrap up the lessons that we have learned in relation to the three-part webinar series that we have just completed. Leadership in educational leadership in times of a crisis. And actually, I'd like to ask Vignesh one specific question. If you could kindly bring us back to what motivated you and the Head Foundation to undertake this program. What were the objectives that you wanted to accomplish then? Vignesh?
Thank you, Vicente. When we first thought about this, when the pandemic first struck and all of us were caught flat-footed, we were shocked, we were surprised. We were wondering what we could do. So over the years, the Head Foundation has done its best and done what it could to contribute to the development of educational leadership in Southeast Asia. And through our interactions with educational leaders, we realized how important it is and very often not given the sufficient attention that it rightly deserves. So during the pandemic, one of the first things they wanted to do was to catch up with some of our alumni participants. Everyone, as you are very aware, and I'm sure our audience now know, all the principals who have been talking to us over the last 3 weeks took part in the Certificate in Educational Studies in Leadership program. And so what we wanted to do was to speak with our Filipino participants who we had just left towards the end of last year. I want to catch up with them, see how they're doing and what's been happening. And this was something that we did at the start of the pandemic. And talking to them was just inspirational. We scheduled to have one call with them to learn what they've been doing, what the challenges they're facing and how they were overcoming the pandemic. And what we ended up having were 2 calls because we just didn't have enough time to listen to the amazing work that they were doing. And we realized that there was this wealth of knowledge. There was this great amount of activity that was happening among school leaders, particularly school leaders that we knew in the Philippines and Indonesia, who were doing such great things to improve their educational outcomes, to help their teachers, their community, and their learners during the crisis. So we thought, what can we do to share this with the wider community? So that was the genesis of the webinar series. And then both of us got speaking, and we started to realize that we had some amazing work that these principals were doing. And it was important that the wider community had an opportunity to listen, to engage with them, and our critical friends were able to lend their knowledge, their experience, their wisdom to what was being discussed. So that was the genesis, that was the reason behind why we did it. But Vicente, maybe I can turn around and ask you this. As we were originally conceiving this idea, we then sort of decided on these 3 categories of community, mobilizing your community, nurturing your staff, and caring for your students. Would you like to share a little bit how and what motivated us to have these 3 categories and how they could inform us during this event?
Yeah, thank you, Vignesh. Looking at the experiences of our colleagues in Indonesia, in the Philippines, what was happening in Singapore, and what I was seeing happening in Australia and also in the United Kingdom, where I'm now currently based, I really saw that the school itself, the concept of school needed to be interrogated and needed to be questioned. And I thought that the opportunity to undertake a 3-part webinar series focusing on what I identified as 3 themes that need to be questioned, investigated, and interrogated was really important. So we wanted to start with the school being a building that we find in a community, or in what Jaida said, in a barangay. A barangay in the Philippines is the local community unit, right? The typical notion that a school is independent and away from the community, I think needs to be really questioned. That's why our first theme was harnessing, building the community. We wanted to make sure that the school would be able to work with the community. So in that first webinar series we were really blessed to have a division superintendent, someone who was not a school principal, but someone who had a senior position in the bureaucracy. And that was Dr. Ronaldo Paulson, who handled close to 10,000 schools in his division, almost around that number, right? Primary schools and secondary schools. And he talked to us about the trifocal initiatives that they were doing in their school. That was really impressive, because here we see how the school was being created in such a way that it's no longer a building, but really a whole society effort. I know we had Sophie Andy, our dynamic principal from Jakarta, who told us about the importance of collaboration, communicating, and connecting with relevant stakeholders in the community. Finally, we had our critical friend, Hiron, who warned us about the pitfalls of professional learning, but also told us about the potential power that we could harness from professional learning community. So that was, I think we were able to carefully ask the questions about the school and the need for it to mobilize the community. Did you have additional learning points from that, Vignesh?
Yeah, I think what came across to me very clearly during this webinar, the first one, was observing the efforts that were put in to build the sense of community, build this relationship long before the pandemic. And I think that's very important. And when Dr. Pozon had shared, even though he was new to this role, I think his predecessors had worked on it, and he himself had spent a lot of time building these relationships. It's difficult to build relationships in a crisis, and it's important that we have these strong relationships. And when you talk about learning communities, I think that's another intriguing point, because sometimes we think of professional learning, and we talk about this more in the second webinar. It's very much school-centric, but you're a cluster of schools, you're a division of schools, and there's so much to be learned from each other. Sometimes if we learn from just our peers in our own school, we may not get as rich an experience as we were if we were to discuss with colleagues from other schools, from within the division, who are facing their own unique set of challenges. So that came across to me as a very important point. And what I'm sharing on the screen now was the outcome of the results of the poll that we conducted during the first session. And I think, you know, the huge issue here is really the technological problem, the infrastructure, the lack of a stable internet connectivity, cell signal, and hardware. And this is where the community can contribute so much. We can tap on community resources. We can seek the support, the help of community, of benefactors who could support it, of government and officials who are able to lead the charge in some of these improvements. And I hope that the pandemic gives some deep thought into the kind of investments that a lot of these communities need to make in the infrastructure upgrade that would allow us to tide over future pandemics. So we moved to the second session just last week on the 17th of September, where we had three amazing speakers. And I'll let you, Vicente, share a little bit about your thoughts before I respond.
Yeah, so we had our first webinar really was about mobilizing the community. And I was interrogating the role of the school as an isolated building. It shouldn't be. It should be a community effort. And we're seeing it really starkly during the pandemic, where people are helping out in making the school function. And the other thing that I wanted, that I hope we could all interrogate, was the school being a factory model, which is a product of the post-Fordist notions of what schooling is. And I think in order for us to deconstruct this idea that the school is a factory where kids go through different levels, was for us to refocus our perspective on the people who work in schools, and that we need to nurture the people in the schools, nurturing our staff. So that was really what our webinar theme was for the second one. And we had Domingo Lozande from the Philippines, who calls himself a millennial school leader. And he talked about camaraderie, and he talked about how his painful experiences beginning as a teacher, he channeled these, and to make sure that the people that he was now supervising, he was handling, that he would care for them. So that was really remarkable. And then we had Diana Venci, the school director from Jakarta, who spoke about building relations and nurturing these relations with and among school stakeholders. And she even talked about how on regular occasions they would send out tiny trinkets of gifts, letters to their teachers who were isolated in different parts of Jakarta, or in different parts of Java. So these are really specific ways in which these practitioners really try to nurture their staff. And then Alan Walker, our critical friend for the second webinar, he really shared with us compelling ideas, compelling insights on how we could refocus all our efforts to take care of the people who we work with. And one of the most powerful phrases that he shared with us then is this idea of school leaders becoming pragmatic visionaries, taking a look at the resources they have, taking a look at the challenges that they face, and then seeking out what best option to undertake, but not forgetting the importance of highlighting the well-being and the welfare of teaching staff, of their teachers. I thought that was really very insightful on the part of Alan. What were your thoughts, Vignesh, in that second webinar?
I have to agree. I think Alan did share, and it's important that it's sort of the mental model, right? That teachers are our partners. They're not just our staff. They're not just cogs in a wheel. They're genuine partners, and they're not just their professional abilities, but their well-being as individuals is very important. I think what really inspired me from our two principals was hearing Domingo share of his own challenges as a young teacher and how he was determined not to replicate the problems that he faced as a young teacher, and to ensure that the young teachers who work for him today have a much better experience. I think that was genuinely inspirational. Not being an educational leader myself, but being in a position of leadership, I think it is very important that we internalize, we understand the challenges that we may have faced, and do our level best to try to ensure that those who come after do not face similar challenges. I think that was genuinely inspirational. And from Venci, I think what was so important was the same that came across in the earlier webinar. The idea of building a sense of camaraderie, a sense of community among her colleagues was something she had been doing for a very long time. It was something that she had been working on and putting her energy towards even before the pandemic. So when the pandemic struck, when everybody was caught flat-footed, when everybody was struggling, there was already the sense of community. There was the support network among the teachers, among the educators. There was a genuine sense of trust between the various stakeholders and her. Her teachers, her educators knew that they could trust her, that they could lean on her. I think she also expressed how her board and her management were able to work closely with her. And she had a strong level of trust, so they knew that the school was in good hands and the challenges that she highlighted were real. And also talking about the poll that was conducted, I think once again, it sort of reflects what we came across in the first webinar, where the planning, development, and printed materials to reach students without internet access was the real focus of a lot of the schools that the educators who participated in the webinar shared during this period. And once again, I think this speaks about the issues, the infrastructure issues that were faced. But what did also entice me, or not entice, but intrigued me, were the three other results that came very close. The acquisition of soft skills, becoming familiar with modified assessment processes, and enhancing the technological skills. And I think all three of them broadly talk about really, particularly the latter two, talk about really navigating this new space, technology. And as you talked about, the thinking behind this session was really questioning the traditional model of education, a model that has been around, in my opinion at least, for too long, a model that needs to be rethought. And a lot of conversations been happening around this, Industry 4.0, how the education system has to evolve. And I think the pandemic has forced us to rethink a lot of this. The assessment methods that we have become so accustomed to, do these still work? Are these still relevant? Are they training our children for what the future holds? Or are we preparing them for something that is no longer going to be around? And I think that it came across quite clearly. It forced us to embrace technology. The pandemic has forced us to learn from home. It has forced us to embrace technology. It's forced us to look at education differently. And it comes across also in these poll results that we got. But in the interest of time, I do not want to take too long. So I'm going to just quickly move to our last session, today's session, and maybe hear some of your thoughts. Vicente, I think we had a fantastic session. It was inspirational as always. But were there specific learning points for you that you came across from this session?
Absolutely, Vignesh. So this third theme, caring for your students, for me, I think this is the most critical of all the issues in relation to schooling. I mean, I talked about the school as an isolated institution. We need to rethink that. School factory model, we need to question that. One of the lingering issues in schools, in education, is the inequality that happens among learners. It happens in developing nations, it happens in developed nations. And the pandemic has accentuated these inequalities. So I was very, very pleased to hear our panelists, Jaida, talking about the preferential option that she was pushing for learners with disabilities. And also for Caroline, our school principal from Jakarta, talking about the specific and deliberate steps that they were doing to prioritize and to make sure that the well-being of their students and teachers were taken care of. And then it was really heartening to hear David talk about the idea that learning still goes on and that the social linkages that the students experience is something that can be harnessed. I think one question that I hope all of us are able to think about is how can we learn from this pandemic, which has really accentuated inequalities that continue to exist today in our young learners. Some are disadvantaged, some are advantaged, some have available resources, some do not. These are questions I think that were touched upon by the practical efforts that our school leaders were undertaking in their respective jurisdictions. Vignesh, did you want to add something? Yes.
No, I cannot agree more with what you're saying. And I think one of the things that came across very clearly, especially with our two principals, is the idea of leading by example. I think neither of them expected anything from their educators and even from their students that they were not prepared to do. And I think that is a very, very important part of education. But I also like to just paraphrase the quotation that Jaida shared from the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Education is more than an entry point to a job market, and often that is how we have seen it. But truly, education can be transformational. It's not just about employability, it is also about changing lives and shaping the future. So just to refresh for our audience members, the results of the poll that we conducted today, we won't discuss this too much, both in the interest of time and that we just spoke about it. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank not just our partner at the HEAD Foundation, but a very dear friend, Vicente Reyes, who shares the HEAD Foundation's same vision of educational leadership as a critical part of a successful education system, for agreeing to moderate this session, the three webinars that we have conducted over the last 3 weeks. And I also like to thank today's three speakers, David, Jaida, and Caroline. Thank you for once again inspiring all of us. And I see within our audience many of the previous speakers, so thank you very much for being here.